It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP and former Trade Minister Conor Burns, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Liberal Democrat MP Daisy Cooper, Daily Telegraph columnist and historian Tim Stanley. Today,
the Prime Minister has paid for all of the refurbishment of the Downing Street flat.
But as we come on air, the Electoral Commission announces an investigation into the refurbishment of the Prime Minister's flat. Boris Johnson will face questions about it in the Commons. We'll bring you PMQs live at noon.
C'est un divorce.
No translation required as the European Parliament votes for the Brexit trade deal. We'll look at what's happened to trade with the EU so far.
Stories on leadership come up from time to time, so we'll just deal with it and move on.
She doesn't sound worried, but is her leadership in the balance? And evidence that one jab cuts transmission of COVID by half.
It's significantly less likely for infected people who have been vaccinated to pass the virus on to others. So that's really important, actually.
We'll return to the breaking news about the inquiry by the Electoral Commission in a few minutes' time. But first of all, some other important news you also heard there in the headlines. Let me just show our viewers this tweet from the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. A new study shows one dose of the vaccine can cut the risk of household transmission by up to 50%. This is further evidence that the vaccine protects you and those around you. When you get the call, get the jab. Let's get some more details from the BBC's health correspondent, Anna Collinson. Anna, tell us a little bit more.
Well, we've already seen real-world evidence that vaccines are effective at reducing infections. They offer strong protection from serious illness and are saving lives, hundreds of lives, on a daily basis. But what we haven't seen so far is real-world evidence that they can prevent passing the virus on from one person to another. And that's where this study from Public Health England comes in. They've monitored 24,000 households where confirmed COVID cases had received a vaccination, and they've then compared it with 1 million contacts of unvaccinated cases. And crucially, they found that people who had had a vaccine dose, their first dose, either Pfizer or AstraZeneca, 3 weeks after were less likely to pass on the virus to others, and that data ranged between around 40 and 50%. Now, this study is yet to be fully peer-reviewed, but it's described as extremely encouraging, particularly as it's focusing on households where infections are particularly likely to happen. Ultimately, it's real-world evidence that vaccines are effective in reducing transmission. And you mentioned Matt Hancock there, the Health Secretary. He said this further reinforces that vaccines are the best way out of this pandemic. Now, scientists would agree with this, but they would also say that there are other important factors to managing the virus. So as we move out of lockdown easing, they're calling for a more cautious summer this year, with test and trace being strengthened, and mask wearing, social distancing, all that kind of thing still being extremely vital.
Anna Collinson, thank you very much. Well, as Anna was saying, they are still urging caution, government ministers, but there'll be many who feel, this news will add to evidence for keeping to the timetable set out by ministers for lifting restrictions. Interestingly, Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, who has made a number of suggestions about vaccination during the pandemic, has analysis saying that actually outlining the prognosis for a third wave and proposing a package of measures to prevent it, including pushing back Step 4 of the roadmap from June the 21st until July the 21st, and thereby trying to avoid a third wave over the summer. So my opening question to all of you is, do you agree, Conor?
I want us to get back to normal as soon as possible. Our young people have taken a huge hit. Elderly people have been isolated now for almost 18 months. Businesses have been, as best as we could do, immunised from the worst effects of the lockdowns, but many of them will now reopen and find that they are teetering at the edge. I think as soon as we can get back to some degree of normality, the better. And the Prime Minister and the government have been guided, and that's why they've gone slower than many wanted, to ensure that this is the last time,
right.
that when we reopen properly. The vaccine program has been world leading. We've vaccinated the most vulnerable. And I think this is really welcome news, that we were worried that maybe the vaccine didn't stop the transmission. This now indicates it massively slows that. I think we should stick to the roadmap unless there's radical data that leads us to change it.
OK, so you're sticking to June the 21st. What about you, Stella? Do you think Tony Blair's right? Perhaps a delay of a month would be good?
Well, I read the report and he was saying something eminently sensible, which is we should keep an eye on the data. And if the data changes, we shouldn't be afraid to react to that. I mean, even the Prime Minister was saying there might be a third wave of COVID deaths. And of course, that's a life lost in every family. I would also say this, and I feel this very personally as somebody who is entitled to a vaccine, but not able to have one yet because I'm pregnant. And I think also of all those families with people who are immunosuppressed. I think of those with children, people under the age of 30 who are entitled to particular vaccines. There are still challenges with the vaccine delivery programme that we've got to get right. So it is only right, this study today, great news. Nobody can deny that. But it tells us we still don't know a lot about this vaccine. We still don't know a lot about this virus. We don't know, for example, how immunosuppressed people are responding to it in comparison to other people. So people with things like leukemia and blood cancer. So I think it's absolutely right that we keep everything under review and we keep doing the studies and we keep asking the experts. As much as I'm frustrated as somebody who thinks that the evidence is very clear, for example, that pregnant women should be a priority given the risk of premature birth, we need the JCVI to do its work, we need SAGE to do its work, and we need to be open to the fact that if the figures change, we need to change our strategy, because otherwise we see a potential loss of life. That report is talking about up to 40,000 more deaths. I mean, that's horrific if it were to be true. So it's right that we all ask, well, is this the right thing to do now, or do we need to change in response to the data that's coming forward?
Tim, what do you think? Do you agree with Tony Blair, delay by a month?
Well, I'm a columnist, not a scientist or a public health expert, so I'm not in any position to say what date is right or wrong. What I would say as a layman is I'd observe two things. One is that infections and deaths in Britain are now very, very low. And second, it looks as though the vaccine is actually breaking that pattern of transmission. So it's working. So as a layman, I have to ask, if we're doing the right thing, and if what we're doing is working, then where is the reward for it? Does that not mean, if that is the picture in Britain, that actually the date for unlocking should come forward, not go back? Now, there might be a very good argument as to why not, and follow the data. Don't stick to dates, follow the data. If the data changes, and looking at what's happened in Europe, looking at what's happened in India, I understand why people are cautious and why they are worried. But surely, if it's working, that should be rewarded in some way. So I find talk of actually putting dates back somewhat confusing. Right,
well, you've raised a couple of points. Daisy, yes, the data is very positive here, but Tim mentioned India, and actually Grant Shapps, the Transport Minister, did say that the pandemic is peaking globally, even if it doesn't quite feel like that here. We still have to be cautious. But on the basis of what Tim said, do you think Tony Blair is being too cautious over the dates?
Well, nobody is safe until everybody is safe, and that's the bottom line. Now, this new data is really exciting because it is the first time that we've seen evidence that the vaccine might, in fact, reduce transmission of the virus between different people. But we have to remember that a lot of people have not been offered the vaccine yet. We have to remember that a lot of people can't have the vaccine yet. And we have to remember that for as long as that continues, the virus can still mutate, and it can mutate into new forms that are even more transmissible. And public health experts themselves are urging caution today. And I think it's right that we remain cautious. So MPs are going to be briefed on this data later on today. And we'll look at the data, we'll keep it under constant review, we'll see what the scientists recommend. But it's absolutely vital that the government learns from the mistakes of the past and that we don't end up making decisions in a rash way that lead us to having another lockdown.
All right, we're going to move on and return to the breaking news that I mentioned at the start of the programme. Here is how the BBC is wording it. Electoral Commission to investigate funding of UK Prime Minister's Downing Street flat, saying there are reasonable grounds to suspect an offence. Connor, your reaction?
Well, look, I've just heard the news, Jo, like you have. In a sense, I welcome this because this will bring an end to the conjecture and the speculation, the guilt by accusation, the trial by television and media. But it almost doesn't matter which road you start out on here. The destination is the same. The Prime Minister himself, Boris Johnson himself, paid for the works on this flat. We demand that he lives in that flat, by the way, and if he chose not to live in the Downing Street flat and chose to live in a private residence somewhere else in London, the security costs and the danger to his neighbours would be absolutely immense. I think most people are interested in the government getting on and delivering the vaccine programme that we've just been talking about, reopening the economy, rebuilding our public finances, the levelling up agenda. The Prime Minister won a stunning victory in December 2019. He's going to be the tenant in Downing Street for at least 4 years. He's engaged, he's got a new child. I think it's perfectly reasonable that he wanted to stamp a bit of his own identity on what is going to be his home for the foreseeable future.
Stella?
I think the story is that Boris Johnson is struggling on a Prime Minister's salary to be able to cover the cost. I mean, we all get it. Everyone's been at home a lot during the pandemic, maybe thinking about home renovations. But this is the Prime Minister, and this could lead to the Prime Minister being suspended from the House of Commons. And the challenge is he has form for this. He's been told off before for late registration of his financial interests. And of course, it's not just him. It's things like the Greensill inquiry. It's what's happening with Lord Lister. It's that growing sense that there's a kind of chumocracy at the top of Parliament, and that if you do a favour for one guy, you can get a favour back, whether it is a contract on PPE or being able to get your wallpaper paid for. And above all, I think the public think there's a pandemic going on, and the fact that the Prime Minister seems to be engaged in a hand-to-hand combat with his former consigliere, Dominic Cummings, shows he's not thinking about our families and our lives and what's going to happen next. I think that's what's really worrying about it. It's just a sense of distraction and chaos at the heart of government, as well as a sense that they're not playing by the rules. So why should they expect other people to?
Connor?
I mean, it's well known in Westminster that one of the most dangerous places to be is between Stella and a passing bandwagon. People are interested in what the government is doing to improve their lives. I'm sorry, Stella, but you just sort of sprayed smears around to Ed Lister and some of the other decent people. I am answering the question. The Prime Minister paid for the refurbishment. So was Ed Lister working for the Chinese as well as organising the deal from Downing Street? What we know here is very, very clear. Labour have no answers on education, on health, on the economy. They're hoping that they can sort of make a souffle rise twice and reheat 1990s so-called sleeves. The Prime Minister paid for his refurbishments himself. And I think the public understand that the Prime Minister has been through a really difficult time on their behalf, trying to get on top of this pandemic, trying to protect our economy. Yes, Jo? Yes,
well, but Connor, there is now an investigation, an inquiry by the Electoral Commission, and I have in front of me the words from them. They are now saying that they're satisfied there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. You are quoting the Prime Minister and the government saying, correctly, that Boris Johnson has already said he's paid for it. But who did at the beginning? If the Electoral Commission believes that there is something worth looking into, that is serious, isn't it?
Well, they will look at it and they will come to a conclusion and all the facts will be placed in the public domain. But the point here is very, very clear. Whatever they look at, whatever the journey, whatever the road, it ends in one destination. The Prime Minister paid for the works on that flat in Downing Street himself. And if we want to get into sort of a feeding frenzy here and try and pretend that we're sort of a corrupt country when we're one of the cleanest, most transparent political systems in the world, I don't think it does us any favours at all.
Right. Well, no one has used those words and said that the UK or Britain is the most corrupt country or one of the most corrupt countries in the world. But your words there, whatever the road, it has led to the Prime Minister footing the bill for the cost of the refurbishment eventually. But what is trying to be established here is what happened initially, because it was Dominic Cummings, the former chief advisor who Stella referred to, who actually said that there was a plan. These are his words, his claim, that there was a plan for donors to pay for it, was proposed by Boris Johnson, that he thought was unethical and possibly illegal.
And we end up with the destination that the Prime Minister paid for the works. And that is the material thing. If there was some other question that someone else had paid for it, the Prime Minister had not declared that, that's a totally different ballgame. The Prime Minister paid for these works himself, not the taxpayer, not a donor, the Prime Minister.
Tim, how significant is this?
Oh, it's very hard to tell, isn't it? You're right, by the way. The issue is around tenses. Who in the past did pay or was going to pay could be different from who then paid. The interesting question is, does the public actually care? And we'll probably find out at the Hartlepool by-election and in the local election results. That's where this will finally be tested. Personally, I don't. But then I sort of feel bad because so many of my friends do, and I wonder if I'm alone in that one. But really, it seems like such a strange. It's a mindless scandal, really. Partly because I'm not quite sure why there's so much interest in it, but also I'm unclear why Number 10 can't just simply tell us exactly what happened, exactly when. And in theory, put the whole thing away.
Yes, well, you're not the only one who feels frustrated about that, as we tried yesterday. Daisy, your response. I mean, at least in your mind, the Electoral Commission is now carrying out an inquiry and we'll get to the bottom of it.
I think the whole thing stinks. I simply do not understand why, over the last few days, Number 10 just couldn't come clean, say where the money had initially come from, and to point to where that information had been published. It's had the chance to do so. And the fact that the government keeps refusing and using these kind of linguistic gymnastics to sort of say, well, it's end destination and this is who's going to end up paying for it. I mean, it's an insult, I think, to most people. And it really begs the question, what have they got to hide? The fact that those who are defending the Prime Minister are trying to deflect this by saying the public aren't interested in what cushions he has, I think, again, is a huge insult to the public. The fact is, the public want to know who is influencing the person running the country, and they want to know who is giving money to the Prime Minister. Was that money accepted, or was there an agreement for that? And was there some kind of favour that was offered in return? I mean, it seems really, really sleazy. So we do need this information to come clean. And as I say, Number 10 has had several days to come clean about this, and they refuse to do so.
Tim?
But that's why it's so strange. I mean, everything you've just said, I'm sorry, is wildly speculative. I mean, at worst, what it is theorised might have happened is that the spending came via the Tory party in the form of a loan. I mean, even if that is actually what happened, even if that did break the rules, I think most people would still think, who cares? In which case, I'm left between two stools of thinking that the opposition MPs who are trying to make the most out of this, I just think, really, this is a real non-scandal. But equally, I don't understand why it doesn't just say, who really cares? I mean, who would care that a party would give if that's what happened, would give a loan to refurbish a flat?
Right,
who
well,
gives
Stella, Daisy, I'll come to Stella.
A pandemic, in the middle of Brexit, who gives
Sorry.
Stella.
Absolutely, we should care, because it's about whether the decisions are being made in the public interest or in a donor's interest. Whether it is absolutely right that a pub landlord in Matt Hancock's constituency was the best person to provide PPE, or whether there might be other people who would be better companies but weren't heard by government because they felt they had an obligation to listen to their donors first. And Connor can throw around as many personal insults as he likes. The fact he cannot answer that question, are we really saying that the Electoral Commission would launch an investigation into the current Prime Minister without due cause to believe that there was something to investigate? And the consequences of that could be incredibly serious. Are we really in a political reality now where these gentlemen are going to suggest it doesn't matter if the Prime Minister is suspended from the House of Commons? Are they really going to go to the wall to suggest that that's an acceptable outcome? I'm sorry, you can be as rude as you like, Connor, but the facts are very clear, and the public have a right to understand whether decisions are being made in their interests or the Tory party's interests, because the two are not the same thing,
Connor?
However much you might wish otherwise.
Connor?
Well, I always enjoy accusations of rudeness from Stella. You can get away with whatever you want if you accuse other people of being rude. I'm simply saying the Prime Minister paid for this himself. It appears that Stella has made up her mind. She has made up their mind. There is some malfeasance here that we are trying to conceal. The Prime Minister has paid. Let's see what the Electoral Commission look at. Let's see how long they take. I hope they take a little bit shorter time than the other inquiry that's going on at the moment in Parliament. Has been going on, I believe, for 15 months. There should be a slight acceleration of this sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, I think the public looking on. I had one email, by the way, on this from a constituent, and interestingly, Joe, was this morning say, I see you're going on the television. Please don't say nobody's interested, because I'm interested. That's one person. I've been out delivering leaflets, talking to people in their gardens. No one has raised this. People have been praising the vaccination rollout, the Prime Minister's handling of this, delighted that we're reopening and rejoining a social life.
Okay.
I think this will blow away.
Right. I mean, Stella, just briefly, yesterday, yesterday Labour said that Boris Johnson had lied over how the Downing Street flat was redecorated. Do you think you've judged before the end of this inquiry? Why not wait until the Electoral Commission have actually reported?
Well, the Electoral Commission have just announced an inquiry. So they obviously think there is something there. Unlike Connor, I'm not actually prejudging the outcome of it. What I am saying is that if you are the British public wondering about whether lockdown needs to be moved, wondering what's going to happen to your businesses, the 6 million people who haven't been able to pay a bill, the fact that the Prime Minister is crying about whether he can have gold wallpaper or not and who pays for it, and the worry that that means his focus is not on your families is an entirely genuine concern.
Where has the Prime Minister said that?
Connor,
but tell us where he said that.
I've listened to you. It's actually reported in the newspapers, I guess, because you've been on there and you've already decided what the outcome is. You haven't read them.
Number 10 that he has denied. So we now believe anonymous sources in the newspaper over and above a public statement by our Prime Minister.
I'm sure we're all going to wait and see what the Electoral Commission says, but I think this row proves my point, is the distraction that this causes and the concern that decisions are not being made in the public interest is a fair one. And it is right as MPs that we ask that question. So I won't be shouted down for asking that question where this government is laser-like focused on the needs of people. Well, Connor, you are trying to interrupt me, so that is a pretty clear example of somebody trying to shout somebody.
I'm going to interrupt both of you because I just want to bring up the point that was raised there in terms of the sources of information. Daisy, would you accept that you and your colleagues in the Liberal Democrat Party are resting or placing a lot of stock on what Dominic Cummings, the former chief advisor, has said and claimed over issues like the redecoration of the Downing Street flat? Have you always trusted Dominic Cummings' word?
No, not at all. I don't think there's anybody that trusts Dominic Cummings. So what we have said is that number 10 could come clean. Number 10 could explain where the money had come from initially. They could explain whether it was a loan from the Conservative Party or whether it was from a specific donor. And if it was that loan being made for other reasons? The public have a right to know. And the fact that number 10 hasn't been able to come clean or has refused to do so raises very serious questions. And it begs the question, and I was accused of speculation, but that's what happens. People speculate when answers are not provided. So we'd like to see some transparency from number 10 on this issue. It's in their gift to be transparent before the Electoral Commission starts their investigation, but they're refusing to do so.
Right, well, Connor, I mean, on that, why don't they? Why doesn't number 10 just come forward and answer those questions? I put them to the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party yesterday and he couldn't answer them, Lee Rowley, because it would prevent all of this.
Well, Jo, sorry to repeat, but the destination is the Prime Minister paid. All of that will now come out, all the routes, all the roads, whatever was discussed. I don't know is the answer what was discussed or wasn't discussed. What I do know is the Prime Minister tells us that he paid for this himself. The Cabinet Secretary is conducting a review of it, which is right and proper, and the facts will emerge. But at the end of the day, there is no impropriety. The Prime Minister paid for the refurbishment of the private quarters in number 10, owned, by the way, by the state and by the taxpayer, for which he pays rent while he's there. And as far as I'm concerned, that's quite straightforward. All
right. Just before we move on, and we are going to return to this issue, you won't be surprised about after Prime Minister's questions. Tim, I just want to refer to something that you've written about in your comment piece. Cummings, Dominic Cummings, we've been talking about, the man who played by his own rules, can't throw stones at Boris. Why?
Why? Gosh, you've got to remind me what I said now. I wrote that 2 or 3 days ago.
Well, you also referred, let me remind you...
a new flat where I'm trying to decorate myself, and so my mind is on other things, I'm afraid. You'll have to remind me of what I said.
Well, you went on to say it's a bit like asking Richard Nixon to become a burglar alarm salesperson.
Yes, that was my substantive point, yes. Well, the only problem with Dominic Cummings now resurfacing as someone arguing that the government wasn't tough enough on lockdown, of course, is that for many voters, the thing they know him for is that he allegedly broke lockdown rules to drive to Durham with his family and then to take a day trip to Barnard Castle. And the issue I've always had with Dominic Cummings is he's an odd man. He's one of those people who is anti-politics, yet obsessed with politics. He's anti-expert, yet he thinks that government should be run by experts, just specifically him. And this row between Cummings and Boris could do damage because next month he's going to speak to MPs. He's going to tell them stuff which will make great headlines and which will perhaps trigger the assessment of precisely what happened during the lockdown that we do need to have. There's always a risk that because of the success of the vaccine strategy, we forget what happened earlier in the lockdown, the debates about when to lock down. And as a result, we miss out on the lessons that we could learn from that. So that could do some good. But ultimately, this is a vote leave internecine war. It's a battle between two people with very different visions of how to do politics. it's not something which I feel really touches upon the issues of the moment.
All right, well, I'm glad you've remembered it now. I love the fact that you can forget what you've written about. I do, certainly what I say on the television, within minutes and days. Right, we're going to move on. I am going to welcome the BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam, and also give you the news that MEPs in the European Parliament, it's very empty looking, I don't know if we can show you the pictures, have voted overwhelmingly to ratify the Brexit deal. And Boris Johnson has tweeted his response to it, saying that he is extremely pleased about the fact that it has been ratified. Great news that the European Parliament has voted overwhelmingly in favour of our zero tariffs, zero quotas, trade and cooperation agreement. Now is the time to look forward to a new relationship with the EU and a more global Britain, which is what I want to discuss with you, Faisal. And before we do, it's early days, I know, in terms of making a full assessment about the impact on the EU-UK trade, but I think we can show people a graph, an indication UK trade in goods with the EU. You can see their massive drop-off during or from the beginning of the pandemic. It's recovered a little bit, but what would you say?
Yeah, so in January, the numbers were really pretty horrific. The number, fall 44% in exports to the EU. There was a recovery, and it sounded like it was quite similar, but it comes from a much lower base. So you don't make up what you lost in January. There are other reasons as well to throw into the mix. Obviously, the pandemic, there was some stockpiling in December. It's always better to look at these figures over sort of 3 or 4 months. But the early patterns were, as you'd expect, when you get the introduction outside of the single market and the customs union of what are called non-tariff barriers, filling in forms, checks, all sorts of stuff that tend to be quite important, actually, and potentially more important than those zero tariffs. That the Prime Minister talked about, as important as it was to get a zero tariff deal. You get these problems. And then what happens with these figures is that they come out, but then HMRC, taxman and woman, releases a set of detailed figures of each kind of line item. And that's where it gets, I mean, for me at least, really quite interesting. You see which commodities have gone down the most, and you start to see patterns. And you can start to sort of pin, for example, the fall in textile exports, which is pretty sharp, the fall in food exports as well, which has endured into February. You can start to say, well, that really is obviously a result of some of those forms. I visited, for example, fish exporters, where they showed me 72 pages worth of forms that they had to fill in. Fishing, obviously, one of the industries where if you had to bet on it a year ago, 3-4 years ago, you'd expect them to be kind of lifting Champions League trophies of success. And that's certainly not the case. And so the figures for February, where we have seen a bounce back in the food industry, is, for example, cheese exports to the EU are down 64%, beef down 78%, fish is down 31%. And if you actually combine the 2 months together, it's the different. There is a sharp difference between the fall to the EU and non-EU.
Right, Conor, you're a former trade minister. Listening to those figures and the falls in key areas and key industries, it's not as high as it was.
It's moving in the right direction, Jo, but there was always going to be a degree of disruption as businesses got used to doing things differently, perhaps having to do checks and forms that weren't there when we were members of the European Union, the single market and the customs union, but things are settling down. It's probably more challenging, if one is objective about this, to gauge exactly what impact Brexit has had in that, what impact the pandemic in the UK and in other individual member states of the EU. But it's fantastic news that the European Parliament have ratified the deal. The deal, by the way, if we recall, that so many people thought the Prime Minister, number one, didn't want, and number two, wouldn't be able to get. It's the start point for a new relationship. You know, in the old words of the poem, to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. This is the beginning of a new relationship with Britain as an independent sovereign country with our European friends and allies in the EU. Ireland, I'm sure we'll come on to, but that's really, really important. There's room for improvement and changes there, but it's good news.
All right. Well, Daisy, listening to that, clearly there has been a hit. Clearly we've heard the figures from Faisal there to certain sectors, but it's not been the catastrophe that you and your colleagues and your side in the Brexit debate warned about.
Well, that's because there is a deal in place. I mean, it's not a no deal. But let's be honest, let's not kid ourselves. It is an incredibly thin deal. And it has actually been a disaster for some businesses and for some sectors. This is the first trade deal in history that actually puts trade barriers up. There has been a huge increase in form filling and red tape. I've been inundated with emails from my constituents, some of whom have had to move their businesses to Ireland because they simply can't function here anymore. Others who have had to buy products from abroad and then they've been hit by surprise charges that they didn't know about. So it has been incredibly disruptive. It's a bad deal, and I think it's bad for business. And the Federation of Small Businesses has itself said that it's very bad for small businesses as well.
Faisal, just really, can you disentangle the pandemic, if you like, in terms of the impact on these figures, these trade figures?
Not fully,
no.
Is the honest answer. I think if you look at, as I said, in certain sectors, it's pretty clear that that's more of a post-transition period effect. I think just to pick something up that you said and has been talked about is what the government will point towards is that the number of lorries going over the channel has normalised. There's an extra proportion of those that are empty, which have contributed to these numbers. But what you haven't seen is the catastrophic reasonable worst-case scenario where we'd have got a gummed-up channel and that would have all sorts of impacts for medical supplies and food supplies and water supplies. That hasn't happened, and they're now decommissioning almost all of those contingencies.
Right. I mean, Tim, several years on from the referendum, was it right for Brexit, for the whole issue around the relationship with the EU to be pitched by both Remainers and Leavers in the sort of binary defining way that it was when we see where we are now?
It's a very interesting question, because I do wonder if in the long run there'll be political capital for a party to favour rejoining the customs union in some way, excuse me, because of all the problems that you've just raised. I think Brexiteers do have answers for the trade questions. They include, they were stockpiling last year. This might partly be because of the lockdown. It is moving in the right direction. Plus, there are new trade deals. And it's possible that we will see a shift in trade away from Europe and towards the rest of the world. I think Liz Truss's trade deals at the moment amount to something like £900 billion worth of trade, which is pretty impressive. But what you can't get away from is that the agribusiness in particular seems to be very hard hit. And also small businesses are struggling with the red tape and with the paperwork. And particularly given that Brexit was sold as a series of new opportunities, and it was seen as pitching small business against corporations, the little guy, big people and all that sort of thing. There's no denying that I think there's going to be a long-term political fallout from this loss of trade. And that's particularly felt within the fishing industry, which again, Brexiteers put a lot of store by Brexit will be good for fishing. And let's be honest, the deal that was struck was far from perfect and is perceived to have not been good for fishing. And you're going to have an ongoing row with France over it. So I'm wondering if in the long run, the future for Labour is not to be in favour of reversing Brexit, because that's a total non-starter and will lose them support in the red wall seats in the north, but perhaps favouring something like the Norway option, where you look re-entering the customs market and starting afresh.
Well, what do you think, Stella? Should Labour be looking at that?
Oh, look, I certainly think we should be looking at where we could have struck a better relationship with Europe. I mean, let's not kid ourselves about this deal. We know that a quarter of all small businesses have temporarily suspended sales and imports and exports with Europe until they work out what is going on, because always with Brexit, it wasn't necessarily the big things, it was the paperwork that was going to get people. And we know that the rules of origin checks that this deal will mean still have to continue are incredibly onerous. And no matter how used to businesses get, it's still a lot more work, a lot more paperwork, a lot more red tape than they were having to deal with. I think there are questions about the kind of deal we could have had and where we have those phytosanitary deals. Clearly, the agriculture sector has been particularly hit by this, as well as the fishing sector. And obviously, we haven't yet talked about what is going on in Northern Ireland, but that's a very serious situation as well.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, look, the detail now is what matters. And of course, this doesn't cover services, which is, of course, a big chunk of our economy as well. Now, obviously, with the pandemic, and it's very difficult to unpick what's going to happen, but clearly our economy is going to be hit by Brexit. That's a given. The question is how big a hit and how do we recover in terms of helping people? Why on earth did the government reject the deal around artist visas, for example?
All right, well,
one of our biggest exports is music and entertainment, and we've just clobbered the artistic industry in this country by saying that basically they can't tour Europe anymore.
Just before I come back to Faisal, Connor,
not with that ridiculous visas.
Do you want to respond to what Stella's said?
Well, look, the first point, Jo, we have a deal, and that's a deal that we can, over time, build on. I think the exciting element of this is the point that Tim alluded to, and the work that's going on cross-government, particularly within the Department for International Trade. So, for example, our largest single nation that we do trade with is the United States of America. We don't actually have a trade agreement with the United States. We trade on WTO terms. There are lots of countries around the world that have potential for enormous growth. And the reality is that the EU size of the global economy has been shrinking over the decades and is expected to continue to do so. And there are opportunities for us around the world. I saw that when I traveled to Vietnam, to Brazil, and these sort of places. They're anxious to do trade agreements with us, and there are enormous opportunities, both on our doorstep in the EU, of course. Yes. They'll remain our closest market, our biggest market, but there are great opportunities for the United Kingdom, all of the United Kingdom, by the way, around the world in the years ahead. All right,
Faisal, those great opportunities, those trade deals around the world, could they possibly match any loss of trade with the EU, and how are they going?
The conventional economist answer to that is that it's difficult to see when you trade so much, just under half our trade with the EU. It's difficult to see how that's replaced. A government says, well, actually, the economy's changed. They all, we've seen what's happened during the pandemic. They become more sort of service and digitally based. Maybe that means that the economists are being a bit pessimistic about analyses that are based on goods trade. But this, I think, the discussion you've had really opens up the contours of quite an interesting debate, because one of the things about the agri-food industry is that it isn't Brexit per se that have caused the issues there. It is the flavour, the choice, exactly where Boris Johnson himself, not Theresa May, has chose to land Brexit that's led to these extra checks. So there are options, for example, to have, now we've separated, to kind of come together on a sort of veterinary agreement, for example. There will be sovereignty questions around that, but I wonder why that's not more of an issue politically. There are options here. One of the reasons why, is what Connor just alluded to, was that under Donald Trump, we wanted to do a trade deal with the US, and the US administration's interest was actually in a clean break between the UK and the EU. That dynamic has now changed. Indeed, Liz Truss had a virtual meeting with Catherine Tai, President Biden's trade rep, yesterday. Yes. And in the readouts of both of those, there was no mention of the US-UK trade deal. There was climate change, there was vaccines, there was no mention at all, which would have been extraordinary a year ago. So there's been a big change of attitude. They're doing a review in America about what they want from a potential trade deal. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of talks. There's a deadline. Should they lose their authority for fast-track negotiation? Very, very soon indeed. OK, well, Faisal, we'll talk about this again very soon, I'm sure. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about the situation in Northern Ireland and the First Minister, Arlene Foster. Let me just show you this in the Belfast newsletter. Arlene Foster's time as DUP leader coming to an end as 75% of her MLAs sign letter of no confidence. Let's talk to Emma Vardy, our Ireland correspondent. What's happening, Emma?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a pretty dramatic 24 hours. And don't forget, the character of the Democratic Unionist Party is usually a very disciplined one. In its whole 50-year history, it doesn't really have leadership contests or sort of outward coups very often. Arlene Foster's only the third leader of the Democratic Unionist Party. So for this to happen, it's a pretty dramatic collapse of confidence in her. Why has it happened? Well, a number of reasons. But look, it's been a pretty difficult couple of years for the DUP. In terms of Brexit, the party had that seemingly influential position at Westminster, aligned themselves, championing Boris Johnson, and then were effectively cast aside because he agreed to a deal which, for the DUP, in many ways, was the worst of all worlds. It put barriers to trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, something that has made the DUP and many unionists absolutely furious. Now, this has all happened at a time when Arlene Foster has been at the helm, and it seems that she's now paying the price for it. There is a feeling from some that perhaps she didn't use her influence at Westminster well enough, that she then wasn't strong enough in opposing those Brexit arrangements, the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, look, who's to say with a different leader it would have panned out any differently? Perhaps that was always going to be the direction of travel of Brexit. But look, people feel unionism is in a precarious position at the moment, very much weakened as a result of what's happened with Brexit. There's a load of other issues too, but those are the sort of headlines for you. And it seems like her leadership is hanging from a thread, and it really doesn't look like she can continue. But we're sort of waiting to see what's going to happen.
OK, Emma Vardy, thank you very much. Connor, you know the DUP well in terms of working with them in the past. What do you make of this?
Look, firstly, I feel a degree of sympathy for Arlene Foster. I have worked closely with Arlene. I know her well. I think she's a lady of decency and integrity who wants to see progress in Northern Ireland. I think it's wrong, if I may say so. I think everything Emma said is correct. But in a throwaway remark at the end, she said, and there are loads of other issues. There are loads of other issues. So I don't think it's entirely about Brexit. I'm from Northern Ireland. I'm from Belfast. I'm a Catholic. I'm a unionist. Got loads of family still there. I've watched with horror the escalating violence within working class loyalist communities, and Shore Road, close to where I was brought up, in Sandy Row and Shankill, parts of East Belfast. There's massive educational underattainment within working class unionist loyalist communities. There's too much emphasis on the peace process, the peace bit, but not the process. It's a bit stalled. There's so much still needs to be done in economic investment, economic opportunity, cultural barriers breaking down. And I think what's happening with Arlene is a coming together of those challenges in the sense that all is maybe not as well as it should be.
Right, and I'm just going to welcome Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor, just to get your sort of reaction to this, because people might be asking, well, what will happen if she goes?
Well, it's an interesting point, and actually people in government, I think, for a while have been worried not just about what's happening on the ground in Northern Ireland, but how it may affect the politics shifting on the ground, and whether or not the DUP would actually be pushed by some in the loyalist community to become harder line and harder line, and then what the consequences might be for power sharing at Stormont, because of course at the moment you have Sinn Féin with the Deputy First Minister, the First Minister from the DUP, but that has not been an easy coalition to put together. Stormont wasn't sitting for a long time. And throughout all of that, I think at Westminster, Arlene Foster has been somebody who the government's been able to reach out to deal with, somebody who has got her own strong views and opinions on behalf of her community and her party. But I think there will be a concern about what might come next if her defenestration does go ahead, because it's a very precarious political balance.
All right, well, let's return to the story, the news that we broke at the beginning of the programme. We spent quite a lot of time discussing it, and that is the inquiry that the Electoral Commission is now going to carry out. How significant is that?
I think it is really significant, Jo. I mean, for a long time, this story started being reported back at the beginning of March, I think perhaps just the very tail end of February, and it seemed really all quite frivolous to some people to begin with, and certainly Conservatives would have said, oh, well, it's about the flat wallpaper, no one's really interested in this. And as the more and more information has come out, we now have the prospect of potentially there having been actual offences being committed. And the Electoral Commission, which is, of course, a statutory body, it has its own powers, they've said that on the record. They've said there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. Now, we should also be clear about what the Electoral Commission is. They have the power to investigate, they have the power to demand information, they have the power to hand out their own sanctions, perhaps force political parties to return cash. But if something gets as serious as potentially being criminal, at that point, they would hand that over to the prosecuting authorities, to the police, to take a look. So we are some way away from anything as sort of dramatic as that. But I think it's a really significant move, and much harder now for Conservatives to just dismiss this and say, oh, people aren't interested, which is the line the government's been trying in the last few days.
Right. I mean, Tim, I know that you said earlier you weren't sure about how much interest there is in these sorts of things. Something on slightly a tangent, I suppose, but if I show you this tweet, I know you can't see it, but I will read it to you, but our viewers can. It's from John Lewis and Partners, and this, of course, is referencing the fact that the flat was described as a John Lewis nightmare because Theresa May had decorated it for Boris Johnson and his fiancée. Phew, it says, the John Lewis social team have just finished an all-day brainstorming session to find ways for people to talk about us on Twitter. Have we missed anything, Tim?
Well, I live in a John Lewis dream. I buy everything from John Lewis, which probably says a lot about my class. But I'm told actually that this is inaccurate, and that in fact Carrie does like John Lewis and actually does order a lot of things from there. So whereas the designer who is supposed to be behind the new flat It's an intriguing sort of boho look that they've gone for. It looks a bit like an Indian restaurant. But I love John Lewis. I go there all the time.
Right, well, I don't want to be too frivolous about this, but I saw, Conor, you nodding your head there. Stella, what do you make of it?
Oh, look, good on the social media team at John Lewis, but frankly, there should be more important issues that the government is focused on. And the fact that we've got to this place where the Prime Minister, the sitting Prime Minister, could be facing electoral charges. I'll tell you one thing as well, though, about the Electoral Commission. I'd love to see them looking at this issue about who can stand for Parliament, because right now in the Hartlepool by-election, there is a candidate who's been convicted of a serious sexual offence who is standing and talking about his victim, and that's possible to do. But the fact that the Electoral Commission has decided that there is enough evidence to go forward, I think, is what should trouble the British public.
All right, well,
because it means that the Prime Minister is in trouble and his focus is going to be attracted accordingly.
Conor?
Can we just have a quick thought for Carrie here, because she's having to read all this stuff. She can't answer back. Her crime, if you like, is being engaged to the Prime Minister. And some of the stuff that's been written about her is gratuitously offensive and so wrong.
All right, we'll leave that there. I want to quickly pick up, Laura, with you, the news about the new Commissioner for Standards.
Yes, so the person who's the kind of official sleaze buster for the government is the ministerial advisor.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We're going to have to stop it there because it's Prime Minister's questions, and thank you to my guests.
House are with the people of India. We're supporting India with vital medical equipment, and we will continue to work closely with the Indian authorities to determine what further help they may need. Mr. Speaker, I also welcome last week's Court of Appeal decision to overturn the convictions of 39 former sub-postmasters in the Horizon dispute, an appalling injustice. Sir Wyn Williams is leading an ongoing independent inquiry that will report this summer. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Let's go to Andrea Jenkins. Andrea. You're on mute, I think, Andrea. Have you got the answer? Tell us more about PMQs. I'm sure the Prime Minister knows the answer. Prime Minister. You can't do it. What I'm going to do, I'm going to try and come back. I'm going to go to Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his remarks about the humanitarian disaster we're witnessing in India? I know the UK has already committed some support, but given the scale and gravity of the disaster, I hope the Foreign Secretary will set out today what more the UK will do to help the Indian people in their hour of need. Can I also join the Prime Minister in his remarks about the Post Office case and ongoing injustice? And of course, today is International Workers' Memorial Day. And this day, this year, after all the sacrifices our frontline workers have made during the pandemic, it's even more poignant than usual. I join in solidarity with all those mourning loved ones today. Mr. Speaker, it was reported this week, including in the Daily Mail, the BBC and ITV, backed up by numerous sources, that at the end of October, the Prime Minister said he would rather have, and I quote, bodies pile high than implement another lockdown. Can the Prime Minister tell the House categorically, yes or no, did he make those remarks or remarks to that effect?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, and I think the right honourable gentleman is a lawyer, I'm given to understand. I think that if he's going to repeat allegations like that, he should come to this House and substantiate those allegations and say where he heard them and who exactly is supposed to have said those. Who exactly is supposed to have said those things, Mr. Speaker? Because what I certainly can tell him, and he asked about the October decisions, they were very bitter, very difficult decisions, as they would be for any Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, because no one wants to put this country into a lockdown with all the consequences that means for loss of education, for the damage to people's life chances, to the huge medical backlog that it entails. But it was thanks to that lockdown the tough decision that we took, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the heroic efforts of the British people, that we have got through to this stage in the pandemic where we find ourselves rolling out our vaccine, where we've done 50% of the population, 25% of the adult population have now had 2 doses, Mr. Speaker, and lockdowns are miserable. Lockdowns are appalling things to have to do, but I have to say that I believe that we had absolutely no choice.
Yes, Tom.
Well, somebody here isn't telling the truth. The House will have heard the Prime Minister's answer, and I remind him the Ministerial Code says, and I quote, "Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation." I'll leave it there for now. Turning to another issue, there'll be further on this, believe you me, who initially, and Prime Minister, initially is the key word here, who initially paid for the redecoration of his Downing Street flat?
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to misleading Parliament, he may recollect that it was only a few weeks ago that he said that he didn't oppose this government, this country staying in leaving the European Medicines Agency. The fact that he was then forced to retract and leaving the European Medicines Agency was absolutely invaluable for our vaccine rollout. And actually, it was just last week that he said that James Dyson was a personal friend of mine, a fact that James Dyson has corrected in the newspaper this morning. As for the latest stuff that he's bringing up, he should know that I paid for Downing Street refurbishment personally, Mr. Speaker, and I contrast it. Any further declaration that I have to make, I will, if any, I will be advised upon by Lord Guide. But if he talks about housing costs, Mr. Speaker, then the people of this country can make their own decision in just 8 days' time, because on average Labour councils charge you £93 more in Band D, the Conservative councils, and Liberal Democrat councils charge you £120 more. That, I think, is the issue. That, I think, is the issue upon which the British people would like him to focus.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, normally when people don't want to incriminate themselves, they go no comment. Let me ask this. Let's explore this a bit further, Prime Minister. Let's ask it a different way. Either, this is the initial invoice, Prime Minister, initial invoice, either the taxpayer paid the initial invoice, or it was the Conservative Party, or it was a private donor, or it was the Prime Minister. So I'm making it easy for the Prime Minister. It's now multiple choice. There are only 4 options. It should be easier than finding the chatty rat, Mr. Speaker. So I ask the Prime Minister again, who paid the initial invoice, Prime Minister, for the redecoration of the Prime Minister's flat, the initial invoice?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've given him the answer, and the answer is I have covered the costs, and I think most people will find it absolutely bizarre. And of course, there's an electoral commission investigating this, and I can tell him that I've conformed in full with the code of conduct, with ministerial code, and officials have been kept. Have been advising me throughout this whole thing, but I think people will think it absolutely bizarre that he is focusing on this issue. When what people want to know is what plans the Labour government might have to improve the life of people in this country. And let me tell you, if he talks about housing again, we're helping people on the house. I'd rather not spend taxpayers' money, by the way, like the last Labour government, who spent £500,000 of taxpayers' money on the Downing Street flat. I'd rather, yes, they did, tarting it up. I would much rather help people get on the property ladder, and it's this Conservative government that has built 244,000 homes in the last year, which is a record over 30 years. This is a government that gets on with delivering on the people's priorities while he continually raises, I think, issues that most people would find irrelevant to their concerns.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, he talks of priorities. What's he spending his time doing? This is a Prime Minister who, during the pandemic, was nipping out of meetings to choose wallpaper at £840 a roll. Just last week, he spent his time phoning journalists to moan about his old friend Dominic Cummings. And he's telling the civil service to find out who paid for the redecoration in his flat. The Cabinet Secretary has been asked to investigate who paid for the refurbishments in the flat. Why doesn't the Prime Minister just tell him? That would be the end of the investigation. Mr. Speaker, it's been widely reported that Lord Brownlow, who just happens to have been given a peerage by the Conservative Party, was asked to donate £58,000 to help repay for the cost of this refurbishment. Can the Prime Minister, if he's so keen to answer, confirm, did Lord Brownlow make that payment for that purpose?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think I've answered this question several times now, and the answer is that I have covered the costs. I have met the requirements that I've been obliged to meet in full. And when it comes to the taxpayer and the costs of Number 10 Downing Street, it was the previous Labour government. I think Tony Blair racked up a bill of £350,000. And I think what the people of this country want to see is minimising taxpayer expense. They want to see a government that's focused on their needs and delivering more homes for the people of this country and cutting council tax, which is what we're doing. And it's on that basis that I think people are going to judge our parties on May the 6th.
Keir Starmer.
Answer the question. That's what the public scream at their televisions every PMQ. Answer the question. The Prime Minister hasn't answered the question. He knows he hasn't answered the question. He never answers the question. The Prime Minister will be aware that he's required to declare any benefits that relate to his political activities, including loans or credit arrangements, within 28 days. 28 days, Prime Minister, yes. He will also know that any donation must be recorded in the register of ministers' interests, and that under the law, any donation of over £500 to a political party must be registered and declared. So the rules are very clear. The Electoral Commission now think that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. That's incredibly serious. Can the Prime Minister tell the House, does he believe that any rules or laws have been broken in relation to the refurbishment of the Prime Minister's flat?
Prime Minister.
No, I don't, Mr. Speaker. What I believe has been strained to breaking point is the credulity of the public. He has half an hour every week to put serious and sensible questions to me about the state of the pandemic, about the vaccine rollout, about what we're doing to support our NHS, about what we're doing to fight crime, about what we're doing to bounce back from this pandemic, about the economic recovery, about jobs for the people of this country. And he goes on and on, Mr. Speaker, about wallpaper when, as I've told him umpteen times now, I paid for it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I remind the Prime Minister of the Nolan Principles, which are meant to govern the behaviour of those in public office? They're these: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. Instead, what do we get from this Prime Minister and this Conservative government? Dodgy contracts, jobs for their mates, and cash for access. And who's at the heart of it? The Prime Minister, Major Sleaze, sitting there. Mr. Speaker, meanwhile, he talks about priorities. Crime is going up. NHS waiting lists are at record levels, and millions of people are worried about their jobs, including Liberty Steel. Mr. Speaker, don't the British people deserve a Prime Minister they can trust and a government that isn't mired in sleaze, cronyism and scandal?
Mr. Speaker, last week he came to this chamber and he attacked me for talking to James Dyson about ventilators, where we're now sending ventilators to help the people of India. And the following day, Mr. Speaker, the Labour front bench said that any Prime Minister in my position would have done exactly the same thing. It wasn't only a few months ago that they were actually attacking Kate Bingham, saying she was a crony when she helped to set up the vaccine task force that delivered millions of vaccines for the people of this country, Mr. Speaker, and helping us to get out of the pandemic. This is a government that is getting on with delivering on the people's priorities. We're rolling out many more nurses, 10,000 more nurses in the NHS now than there were this time last year, 8,771 more police officers on our streets now than there were when I was elected, including tougher sentences, Mr. Speaker, for serious sexual and violent criminals, which he opposed, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on. And by the way, I forgot to mention mention it. Last night, our friends in the European Union voted to approve our Brexit deal, which he opposed. Which enables us not just to take back control of our borders, Mr. Speaker, but to deliver free, which it does, which he fervently opposed, enabling us, amongst other things, to deal with such threats as the European Super League, Mr. Speaker, but it enables us to deliver free ports in places like Teesside, and above all, taking back control of our country has allowed us to deliver the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, as he well knows, Mr. Speaker, which would not have been possible if we'd stayed in the European Medicines Agency, which he voted for. Mr. Speaker, week after week, the people of this country can see the difference between a Labour Party that twists and turns with the wind, that thinks of nothing except playing political games, whereas this party gets on with delivering on the people's priorities, and I hope that people will vote Conservative on May the 6th.
Let's see if we can calm it down a little. Joy Morrissey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is indeed a world leader in COVID-19 vaccination. May I thank the Prime Minister for the swift action he has taken to deliver this for our country. And will the Prime Minister join me in thanking the many local volunteers, such as Kirsty Griffith, who has been volunteering at the Marlow Vaccine Centre, and Guy Hullis and Paul Bass, who have been volunteering alongside the Denham Community Health. And thank you for the vaccine rollout in South Bucks.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend should thank everybody involved, and it's been a fantastic national effort led by the NHS, led overwhelmingly by GPs, but also by many others, by local council officers, officials, by the army, by many others, and of course huge numbers of volunteers in her constituency and elsewhere. And I thank Kirsty Griffiths, Guy Hollis and Paul Bass very much for everything they've done.
Let's go to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition over the humanitarian crisis in India and the injustice over the Horizon issue at the Post Office. Mr. Speaker, over 127,000 people have died from COVID in the United Kingdom. People have lost their mothers and fathers, their grandparents and even their children. NHS staff have given their all, fighting to keep people alive. That's why so many people find the Prime Minister's remark that he would rather let their bodies pile high in their thousands than go into lockdown utterly sickening. The BBC and ITV have multiple sources confirming that this is what the Prime Minister said. People are willing to go under oath, Mr. Speaker, confirming that the Prime Minister said these exact words, under oath, Mr. Speaker. Now, parliamentary rules stop me from saying that the Prime Minister has repeatedly lied to the public over the last week. But can I ask the question, are you a liar, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I leave it to you to judge whether the right honourable gentleman's remarks were in order. But what I will say to him is that...
Say, unfortunately, we're in order, but we're not savoury and not what we would expect.
I'm grateful to you, Mr. Speaker. But what I would say to the right honourable gentleman is that if he is going to relay that kind of quotation, it is up to him in a place like Parliament to produce the author. The person who claims to have heard it, because I can't find them. He says that they're willing to go on oath. Perhaps they're sitting somewhere in this building. I rather doubt it, because I didn't say those words. What I do believe is that a lockdown is a miserable, miserable thing. And I did everything I could to try to protect the British public throughout the pandemic, to protect them from lockdowns, but also to protect them from disease. And he's right to draw attention to the wretched toll that COVID has brought. And we grieve. I know the whole House grieves for every family that has lost a loved one. It has been a horrendous time. But it is thanks to that lockdown and the vaccine rollout, combined with the vaccine rollout, that we're making the progress we are. And I may say we're making progress across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Let's go back to Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, it's the Prime Minister's behaviour which is not in order. This is a Prime Minister who is up to his neck in a swamp of Tory sleaze. We've seen contracts for cronies, texts for tax breaks, and cash for curtains. The Prime Minister has dodged these questions all week, and he's dodged them again today. But these questions simply are not going to go away. So when exactly was money funneled through Tory HQ into his personal bank account? When did he pay back this money? Was it an interest-free loan? And who is the donor or donors who originally funded it? Is the Prime Minister aware that if he continues to fail to answer these questions, that the Electoral Commission has the powers to prosecute him? Will the Prime Minister publish these details today, or is he going to wait until the police come knocking at his door?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, I look forward to what the Electoral Commission has to say, but I can tell him that for the rest of it, he's talking complete nonsense. And the only thing I will say is that it is thanks to our investment in policing that we're going to have another 20,000 more officers on the streets of our country, and that is a fantastic thing. And we will be making sure that gets through to Scotland as well. What we want to see is a Scottish nationalist government stop obsessing about breaking up our country, which is all they can think about and talk about tackling crime and using that investment to fight crime, which is, I think, what the people of Scotland want to see.
Gary Shamrock. If the Prime Minister was to walk down Bristol Road South in Longbridge today, he would see a small army of JCB diggers levelling out the old MG Rover Westworks site to provide one of the biggest levelling up projects locally, with 5,000 extra jobs at an industrial site. But what people want to see too is a regeneration of Northfield High Street with a proper plan and money on the table. And so does the Prime Minister agree with me that we need people like Andy Street's driven and energetic mayors delivering for the West Midlands, working with me and local Conservative councillors to deliver on this plan? Because after all, Mr. Speaker, teamwork makes the dream work.
Mr. Speaker, I'm lost in admiration for what Andy Street is doing. He's a fantastic mayor of the West Midlands, and he's got a fantastic vision for transport, for jobs, for growth and recovery, and I hope everybody votes for Andy Street on May the 6th.
Right, let us go to Liz Saville-Roberts. Liz.
Diolch yn fawr, Lefarydd. I think it's worth repeating the Ministerial Code's 7 guiding principles: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership. The Prime Minister has spent the week ticking them off on his don't-do list. At the same time, he tries to play down allegations of saying, let the bodies pile high. Given that the sole judge on questions relating to the conduct of ministers and the conduct of the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister himself, what happens when a Prime Minister goes rogue?
Mr. Speaker, the people of this country have a chance to make their own minds up on May the 6th. And when they look at what's happening in Wales, Mr. Speaker, they have a chance to make a choice between what I'm afraid, a continually failing Welsh Labour government or Welsh Conservative administration in Cardiff that I believe has a fantastic vision. 65,000 high-skilled, high-paid jobs, finally addressing the problems of the A55, getting 5,000 more teachers, 3,000 more nurses into the Welsh NHS, solving the problems of the M4, which I've spoken about so movingly many times in this chamber before, Mr. Speaker. I hope that people will avoid voting for Plaid Cymru and that they will vote for Welsh Conservatives on May the 6th in Wales.
Duncan Baker.
Mr. Speaker, as probably the only former sub-postmaster in Parliament, last Friday's ruling was the beginning, not the end. Yes, it will cost a lot of money, and yes, it would take time, and there is more compensation that is needed. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that only a proper judge-led public inquiry can really bring justice to those victims of this horrendous accounting scandal and also hold to account those involved behind the scenes?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his expertise in this matter and thank him for what he has just said, because he's totally right. I think that what happened to those post office workers, the postmasters, the sub-postmasters, was appalling. It was one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in our history, Mr. Speaker, and we are looking indeed at the issues involved, and the former High Court Judge Sir Win Williams will be making recommendations about what further actions, what further apologies we need to make.
Let's go to Howell Williams. Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The PM just raised the matter of the Welsh general election. Well, in March last year, this United Kingdom Conservative government intercepted a deal between Wales and the Roche Pharmaceutical Company for 5,000 daily COVID tests, instructing the company to reserve all additional COVID tests to England. Those tests would have been crucial to saving thousands of lives in Wales. So, as we go to the polls next week, will the Prime Minister tell us why Welsh lives meant so little to him?
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid the honourable gentleman is completely wrong in what he says about tests, but I can tell him that he's right about one thing, which is that Wales has made an amazing contribution to our UK fight back against COVID. And it was incredible to go to the Wockhart factory in Wrexham, to go to that site. And it's Wockhart working together with Oxford Biomedica that has enabled us to roll out the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, Mr. Speaker, that has made such a difference. And I want to say a massive thank you again to those Welsh scientists, all those people working in that factory, because they have helped to save countless lives across the UK.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The integrated review confirms the vital role the atomic weapons establishment in Berkshire will play in our future nuclear capability. I want to pay tribute to them, and particularly to the senior female employees who have won a slew of national awards for their work in defence, science, engineering and nuclear security. Given the government's significant investment in all these sectors, would my right honourable friend say how he plans to improve women's participation in these fields where they've been historically underrepresented, and could I invite him to the AWE to illustrate our success?
Yes. I would be honoured to take up her invitation as soon as I can. In terms of the female representation in that sector, she should, of course, knows that Alison Atkinson became the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of AWE in May 2020, and there are huge numbers of opportunities for women to join our armed services, thanks, Mr. Speaker, above all, to the biggest uplift in defence spending since the end of the Cold War.
Let's go to Sarah Upholney.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment last week to include aviation and shipping into our target emissions. But surely the Prime Minister knows that we will miss this target if we proceed with a third runway at Heathrow. And furthermore, that would undermine the progress that this government hopes to make towards net zero. So will the Prime Minister take this opportunity to commit to amending the airport's national policy statement in light of these commitments?
Mr. Speaker, the third runway at Heathrow is, as she knows, a private sector venture. It's up to them to produce the capital to do it. I don't see any immediate sign of that particular project coming off. I think what we should be looking at instead, and what we are looking at, is the prospect of jet zero aviation, Mr. Speaker, of flying without carbon emissions, or with far lower carbon emissions. And it is in that area that the Department of the Bays and DFT are working together with the manufacturers so that this country leads in guilt-free flying.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Right now, in every part of the country, levels of business optimism are higher than they have been since the start of the pandemic, with many firms planning to hire more staff and create more apprenticeships for our young people. And there's one factor, more than anything else, that underpins that optimism, and that is the success of the UK vaccination programme. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that there's never been a more important moment for voters in Scotland and in Wales to reject the negativity and the divisiveness of the nationalists and instead look forward to a brighter and stronger future as one united kingdom?
Absolutely. I don't know why the shadow leaders, PPS is shaking her head, because surely she would agree with that. We want to work together across the whole of the UK, and I pay tribute to, as I have just said, to the incredible work of the Whatcart factory in Wales, but there's also the Valneva factory in Scotland, and the whole of the United Kingdom coming together, represented by our armed services, and above all by our NHS, helping to deliver that vaccine rollout to protect the country and take it forward.
Let's go to Janet Davey. Janet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is absolutely shocking that we have heard the Electoral Commission is investigating funding of the Prime Minister's Downing Street flat, saying there are reasonable grounds to suspect an offence. Why does the Prime Minister think all of these stories about sleaze, corruption and dishonesty keep happening to him and his Conservative government?
I tell you what, Mr. Speaker, I think it's because people are absolutely determined to find anything they can hang on to talk about, except the vaccine rollout, except our plans to unite and level up across the country, except our plans to fight crime and give people the opportunity to buy their own homes, because they don't want to discuss those issues, because they can't win on those issues, Mr. Speaker, because they've got absolutely nothing to say. And that's what's become clear over the last year.
Let's go to Nick Fletcher. Nick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I ask my question, may I first ask the Prime Minister to join me in thanking all the staff at Doncaster Royal Infirmary and the emergency services for dealing swiftly with a major water leak yesterday. Fortunately, no one was hurt and all patients have been moved safely to other wards. However, back to my original question, the local elections are only days away and would therefore like to ask the Prime Minister if he would offer his full support to Doncaster Conservative mayoral candidate James Hart. James, like me, is a local businessman and will shout up for our town and work closely with me on delivering the government's levelling up agenda.
Minister. Well, look, my honourable friend is absolutely right. First of all, hang on, he's right, Mr. Speaker, to want to thank all the staff of Doncaster Royal Infirmary for what they did for the emergency services in dealing with the incident last night. And I'm glad to take that opportunity. But I'm also glad to take the opportunity to support him in his campaign for James Hart. And I do hope that the people of Doncaster will go out to vote and support him on May the 6th.
Let's come to Christian Matheson.
Speaker, the Prime Minister promised in a series of texts to fix a tax issue for his mate, Sir James Dyson. At that dispatch box last week, he promised to publish those texts, but of course he's not made good on that promise. So when will he publish them?
Mr. Speaker, I promised to publish the account of my dealings with James Dyson, which is exactly what I have done. And I can't believe they don't learn their lesson, Mr. Speaker. They attacked the government for having any kind of discussions with a British ventilator maker last week, or potential ventilator maker last week, and then the following day they did a U-turn and said that any Prime Minister would do it, and they've now done a double U-turn, Mr. Speaker, and they're trying to bash me again. Which is it? Do you believe the government should be supporting British manufacturing delivering ventilators? Yes or no? That's the question for Labour.
Let's go to Dr. Luke Evans. Luke.
Mr. Speaker, my constituency is best for Battle of Bosworth, but we also have many other attractions like Twycross Zoo, Mallory Racecourse, Burbage Common and Thornton Reservoir. Now, these attractions all support superb cafes and pubs. With the bank holiday weekend coming up, does the Prime Minister have any plans? Does he want to pop up to Bosworth? But more importantly, what is the government doing to support these attractions and domestic tourism as we go into the summer?
I want to thank my honourable friend. I want to tell him that no matter how many pints I joined him in lifting in the pubs of Bosworth, it could not do as much for the economy of Bosworth as what we're already doing with the £56 million Welcome Back Fund, probably even more welcome than my presence in Bosworth. I venture to suggest, hotly contested perhaps, and that we've extended the cut in VAT for tourism and hospitality to 5% right the way through till the end of September.
Go to Lillian Greenwood. Lillian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't the truth behind all of this, the sleaze, the scandals, the jobs for your mates, the cash for curtains, that the Prime Minister thinks that rules, laws and decency are for other people, the sort of people who shop at John Lewis or IKEA or Argos, who don't have wealthy donors to fund their lifestyle. Not for people like him and his ministers.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think what people think is that the Labour Party are losing all the arguments across British politics. They've got nothing to say. They've got no plan for our future and no vision for our country. They see a Conservative government that is getting on with uniting and levelling up with the most ambitious agenda any government has had for generations. And I think that's what they're listening to.
Let's go to Ben Bradley. Ben.
Prime Minister, next week residents here in Nottinghamshire will go out to vote for the first time since that incredibly successful 2019 election, where they elected a full slate of Conservative MPs across every constituency in this county. Despite that success, many areas like Mansfield and much of the new Blue Wall across the Midlands and North will still have mainly Labour councillors at a local level. Does my right honourable friend have a message for Nottinghamshire voters who have the opportunity next week to elect a Conservative local team that can work with our MPs to deliver for Nottinghamshire?
Yes, I do, and I want to thank him for all the wonderful work that he does for his constituency. My message would be, yes, I hope that people of Nottinghamshire will get out and vote Conservative, because it's we who share your priorities on crime, on the NHS, on investment in infrastructure and on levelling up across our country. So I hope you will vote Conservative on May the 6th.
Right, let us go to Rachel Hopkins. Rachel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When was the Prime Minister and his Chief of Staff first made aware of the plan for a European Super League?
I first was made aware of the plan for a European Super League on, I think, the Sunday night, and we acted decisively, using the arsenal of legislative freedoms that we now have, thanks to leaving the European Union, which he opposed. Of course, we acted decisively to make clear that the UK government took a dim view of this matter, Mr. Speaker, and the same goes for my Chief of Staff.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency of Stroud recently won the Best Place to Live, and there is much to visit there, including a historic lamp standard that was erected to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. And next year, our own Queen will mark her succession to the throne of 70 years. And I would ask the Prime Minister, will he join me in supporting the gift being proposed by Parliament to mark Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee?
I want to thank my honourable friend for a wonderful proposal, and I would certainly encourage all colleagues to support and to contribute to her project.
We're now going to go back to Andrea Jenkins. Andrea.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next week, we will elect our first mayor of West Yorkshire. Now, does the Prime Minister agree with me that for far too long, Labour have taken our northern heartlands for granted? On Thursday, the 6th of May, we'll have the opportunity to elect patriotic, hard-working northerners like Matt Robinson, Ben Houchin and Jill Mortimer in Hartlepool. They will be strong voices and champions for infrastructure and housing and jobs. We must seize this chance to build back better after the pandemic, and that only the Conservatives will deliver on this.
Well, Mr. Speaker, they don't like that sort of thing, do they? They don't like focusing. They don't like focusing on the issues that actually matter to the British people and the people of West Yorkshire. I thank my honourable friend. She's absolutely right. I hope they will go. The people on May the 6th will get out and vote for a party that believes in supporting our NHS, that believes in fighting crime, not being soft on crime, and that will bring jobs and regeneration across the entire country. And I hope that they will vote Conservative on May the 6th.
Order. I'm now suspending the House for 3 minutes.
That brings us to the end of Prime Minister's questions. And in case you didn't realise, there are some elections happening on May the 6th, but we'll come to that, of course, at another time. Now, there's going to be an urgent question in the Commons on the serious COVID situation in India, and you can watch that on BBC Parliament. But now, let's introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. Welcoming Robert Courts, Transport Minister for the Government, Alex Norris, the Shadow Health Minister, and Laura Kuenssberg is here, of course, the BBC's political editor. Well, unsurprisingly, Laura, it was a very uncomfortable Prime Minister's questions again, perhaps even more intensely than last week. He was being attacked over several issues. This, of course, following the news that the Electoral Commission is now going to investigate how the Downing Street flat, number 11, was redecorated and who actually paid for it. But let's return to Keir Starmer, the Labour leader's initial questions, by the end of which Boris Johnson was angry and delivered a somewhat rambling peroration, if you like, in response. And the question to start off with were the words that he was asked about. Did he actually say that he would rather let the bodies pile up high than order another lockdown?
Yes, and those remarks that have been very widely reported, including by the BBC. But the Prime Minister repeated his denial, which he did also earlier this week. And just for our viewers, there is also a significance to ministers denying something at the dispatch box, because if you like, that puts it into the official record. And there are strong conventions, of course, about the importance, but almost a sort of sacred nature of what people say at the dispatch box. So it's interesting that he gave such a flat denial in that particular context. But I think it was also very notable just how angry Boris Johnson was at the end of all of that. He did not answer in full the questions about the Downing Street flat, that very clear question, who initially paid the costs. He just repeated the fact that he says he covered the costs himself. But the question that's been at the heart of this throughout is who paid to start with. Was it a Conservative donor? Was it the Conservative Party itself? That's what's at heart here. And he just wouldn't answer it. And by the end, I've never seen Boris Johnson like that at the dispatch box throughout his many, many performances in Parliament, visibly really angry. And his final answer, as you suggested, was a very, very long sort of attempt at a political attack on the Labour Party. But it was quite something. We haven't seen that kind of atmosphere when he's been Prime Minister at the dispatch box before.
Robert, wasn't this the sort of prime opportunity for Boris Johnson to answer some of those clear questions about who paid initially for the Downing Street refurbishment?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's been entirely clear that he paid for that wider refurbishment at number 10. Number 10, of course, being in that unusual position of being both an office and a home. And with regards to the further detail, of course, as we know, there's going to be a number of inquiries into that. We've got the Cabinet Secretary who's been asked to look into it, and he will be reporting in due course. You've also got the Cabinet Office at end of year annual reports who'll be looking at that as well. And then, of course, the Prime Minister now has his independent advisor on ministerial interests. So that's where the detail will come. But we can be absolutely clear about one thing, which is the Prime Minister paid for that refurbishment.
But so why won't you just answer the question about who initially paid for it? Why has this come down to semantics? I hear everything that you say, and the Prime Minister too, but it's a very straightforward question to which Boris Johnson obviously knows the answer. Who initially paid for it?
Well, there's a process to be followed in all these things. And as I say, we have that investigation that's being carried out by the Cabinet Secretary.
But why does there need to be an investigation into that? But why does there need to? But why does there need to be an investigation and a review? It's a lot of resources being deployed, isn't it, over something really quite straightforward?
Well, I think in all of these circumstances, there is always a process that has to be followed. I think that's absolutely right. You'll always see such details in particularly the Cabinet Office annual report. You also have, of course, the Cabinet Secretary's report. It's right that that follows the proper course and that you get the details in there. But we can be absolutely clear that the Prime Minister has paid for the work that was undertaken, all that refurbishment work. And what he's doing is concentrating on what really is a massive success story for the country, which is this incredible vaccine rollout, where we're seeing now, 1/3 of the entire adult population have now been vaccinated. About a quarter of the population have had their second jab. And this gives us enormous optimism and hope for the future. It's an incredible success. That's because of the Prime Minister driving this forward. It's achievement.
Right. However hard Robert tries to deflect from the questions about the Downing Street flat, Laura, it's not working, is it?
It's clearly the Prime Minister, I think, is repeatedly going to be asked these questions until he answers it, because there wouldn't normally be a process about these kinds of things. It is, as you say, a straightforward question. Downing Street hasn't wanted to answer it. And lots of our viewers might be wondering, thinking, this is really trivial. This is about who paid for the wallpaper and the rattan and the whatever posh light fittings or whatever were or were not put forward in the renovation of the Downing Street flat. It is the fact that the government has not answered that has sort of created all of this fuss, really. And it's not just the investigations that the Minister mentioned there. Remember, now the Electoral Commission is looking at whether or not an offence has actually been committed here. And I just wonder to the Minister, do you not even find it rather frustrating that you don't have the straight answers either to give to our viewers today, and then everybody could move on?
We can be entirely clear. The thing that really matters is the fact that the Prime Minister paid for those refurbishments, as we've heard. And this has been looked at from a number of angles.
But if there's nothing to hide, Minister, why not just give the full details? If there's nothing to hide about whoever picked up the tab for the wallpaper or whatever it was, why not just give a clear answer, and then everybody could move on? Nobody would have to worry about it. The Electoral Commission wouldn't be having to investigate. Just give the answer if there's nothing to hide.
Because you'll get that answer in due course once the Cabinet Office gives its annual report or the Cabinet Secretary reports. There's a proper process to be followed, and I think it's right that's what we do.
I mean, Alex, isn't that now the situation? I mean, Keir Starmer's put those questions. There is a process. The Electoral Commission is investigating. You shouldn't prejudge the outcome.
No, we've said throughout we just want a clear exposition of the facts, but the reality is we could have had that within the first 45 seconds of Prime Minister's questions, and instead we got a rather evasive and a bit bizarre performance from the Prime Minister, who ended up flapping around, shouting about everything but in an attempt to try and put people off it. You know, this really matters. It matters for two reasons. One, you know, if somebody paid for this upfront, what were they expecting in return? We know that if you used to run a pub near Matt Hancock, then you got good access to getting contracts. What did this person expect if there was someone who did this? And secondly, was this really what the Prime Minister was doing at a time when the UK was heading towards the worst death count in Europe from COVID, and the Prime Minister was panhandling around because John Lewis furniture isn't good enough for him? I think people would find that an extraordinary order of priorities. So I think that's why it's important that we keep talking about it.
Right, but you don't have any evidence, do you, to support those claims as yet? And you say you want to wait for the facts to come out about how and who may have paid initially. But yesterday, Labour said categorically that Boris Johnson had lied about how the refurbishment was paid for. So are you waiting for the results of the inquiry, or are you prejudging it?
Well, look, I'm not going to act as judge, jury and executioner, and we will get that report. As I say, we could have had it, 15 minutes ago. We could have had it a week ago. What we know for sure, because we've been pursuing this for some time, is that the position has changed from the government. At the beginning, they said it was a donor. Then, oh, no, it wasn't a donor. It was the Tory party. Then, oh, no, it was Boris Johnson. So the truth has changed from them. And, so that has definitely happened. And this gets to the very root that they are seeking to evade here. And I think it should be really shocking and really quite something that today the Electoral Commission, they're not just opened an investigation. They have said that there's reasonable grounds to suspect that there may have been an offence. So I think there's reasonable grounds for us to say that there may well have been one too.
Robert?
So look, if we're talking about deflection here, I think what we've seen today at the dispatch box from Labour is a leader that is more lawyer than leader, who has nothing constructive to say about the issues that the country is absolutely facing. Let's not forget about the amount that New Labour spent on that Downing Street flat, which was public money. Let's not forget the fact that Keir Starmer opposed the vaccine task force, and it's that that's led to this incredible rollout of the vaccine that we all have. You have here a Labour leader and a Labour front bench that is just trying to distract from the fact they have no answers to any of the problems that the country faces, and no answers whatsoever to any of the issues that we absolutely have to deal with. The Prime Minister is answering and has rolled out the testing regime that's absolutely extraordinary, this incredible vaccine success, and is driving us out of the pandemic.
Alex, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I mean, poor Robert, I know he's got a job to do here, and I know he will have been press ganged into doing it, but these are important matters of public probity. Decency matters in British political life. We know that confidence in politics is low and gets lower by the year. And when people see us just come on and try and throw something else out there to try and distract from the reasonable issue of just asking someone whether or not they paid for works, whether somebody else did and if so, why they did. That's what really undermines public confidence. Robert, obviously an officer of the court in his time too, I know he wouldn't accept that if we were talking about a Labour leader. So come on, we can all do an awful lot better than this, because people are watching and they think the whole thing's really unseemly.
Right. I mean, can I just get back then to one of the specific questions that was posed, Robert, about the funding around the flat refurbishment, which is, did Lord Brownlow, a donor, make that initial payment?
Well, look, we can only be clear about the things that I've already explained to you. We know that the Prime Minister has paid, and so we can be absolutely clear about that in response to what Alex was saying just now. The Prime Minister has paid.
We've got that. We've got that. Do you think there is any? Do you think there is any room there that somebody else paid earlier on?
So look, you'll get all of the details that have to, the rules have been complied with. You'll get the details in the Cabinet Office report in the fullness of time. The only thing we can be clear about now, and we absolutely can be, is that the Prime Minister paid for that.
OK, so you, like the Prime Minister, when asked, have any rules or laws been broken in the process for funding this refurbishment, he says, no, I don't, and you agree? You're confident no rules have been broken, all the declarations that needed to be made have been made?
I'm quite confident that all the rules have been complied with, yes.
Right. Alex?
Well, the Electoral Commission said they think there's reasonable grounds to suspect an offence has been committed. So I'm going to go with what the Electoral Commission think, rather, frankly, than what Boris Johnson said or Robert said, frankly, because they're the independent arbiter of such matters.
Right. I mean, Laura...
No, we don't prejudge this, though. I mean, investigations happen, and I understand the Electoral Commission are looking into it, but Alex is prejudging it. He very much is. He's assuming that there's been a finding. There hasn't. There is a Cabinet Office investigation from the Cabinet Secretary and the Cabinet Office reports. Yes, the Electoral Commission are looking at it. So it's being looked at from a number of different angles.
But, Minister, isn't that exactly what you're doing too? I mean, you've just told us you're confident that nothing's gone wrong and everything's been followed. Alex has said he thinks that something did go wrong, and you're saying to him he shouldn't prejudge it. You've prejudged it. Now, I know in your former life you were a lawyer. Have you actually seen the evidence that makes you feel you're confident that no rules were broken?
Well, you've heard the Prime Minister's explanation of the dispatch box. We can be absolutely clear that he paid for those refurbishments.
In the end, but not initially. Or are you saying you believe that he did pay for it initially?
So clearly, you'll have the details in due course from the Cabinet Office reports.
So you don't know that. I just want to be clear about what you're telling our viewers you know and what you do not know.
I don't have any information further than that I've given you, of course not.
Can you take us through some of the timelines on this? Because people may look at it and listen to these conversations and say, it's all about words, it's all about who said what, it's all about different tenses in terms of answering questions. Yes. But it is important.
It's important if we actually go back to the basic principle, is any politician, particularly ministers, particularly then somebody in such a senior position as the Prime Minister, is meant to declare financial donations or loans, and they can do that in a variety of different ways. We don't have to go through them all. There's a register of MPs' interest, there's ministerial declarations, there's all sorts of different things. But that is a very important principle in this country, that our viewers, the public, have a right to know who has been giving money to politicians, because what might they expect in return? Is it transparent enough? The reason for it all being out there in the open is in order that everybody can see exactly what's going on, so that politicians are beyond reproach and they can't then be accused of giving favours or any of those kinds of things. Now, in terms of the timeline of this, frankly, Jo, because it's still all quite murky, we can't be quite sure. But essentially what a lot of reporting, particularly by the Daily Mail, has suggested is that shortly after he and his fiancée moved into the Downing Street flat, works and plans were undertaken, but when the bill came in, the Prime Minister at that point didn't have the means to settle it himself. It suggested he went looking for other ways of doing it. The bill was, it's suggested, settled by the Conservative Party or a donor. And then in the end, perhaps even quite recently, the Prime Minister settled the bill. We should say, of course, he denies that anything went wrong, but the reason for our viewers why this matters is because it's about politicians being transparent about donations so that we can know that they're not beholden to anyone. But you can quite understand when it's about wallpaper and cushions that quite a lot of our viewers might think, why is everybody in Westminster getting in such a tangle about this? But it's the principle of who is paying and who is financially supporting our political parties.
And Boris Johnson, of course, and other ministers, including Robert, have said as long as it's not the taxpayer higher, then perhaps they don't care as much about that issue. But interestingly, referring to your comments about how angry the Prime Minister was at the end of the exchange with Keir Starmer, this tweet from Kate Ferguson at The Sun: Boris Johnson has just arrived in the tea room in Parliament to rally his troops as he faces major questions over the Downing Street flat makeover. He doesn't do that often. There are growing concerns among Tory MPs that it could harm their chances in local election local election rooms next week. I mean, that is quite interesting, isn't it?
It's fascinating because I think clearly at the beginning of, all of this, whether it's the flat or whether it were some of the things that have come out about PPE contracts for people who had links to the Conservatives, Labour has been hammering away at these issues broadly for a long time. Until quite recently, most Conservative MPs or ministers you asked about it said it's not cutting through. There's quite a sort of feel-good feeling around the vaccine. The government's having a sort of good time. Look at the polls, they're still way ahead, not worried. And also, people kind of know a bit. They quite like the fact that Boris Johnson is someone who maybe doesn't always follow convention as strictly as former prime ministers have done. I think that mood has changed in the last 2 to 3 days, if not just because of the sort of laws of political physics. There's always that saying, if something starts going on for too long, 7 days on the front of the newspapers, and it starts becoming a problem. We are now, well into a long period of reporting on this. And if the Downing Street strategy is just a stonewall until people get bored, I'm not sure that's going to work out. The Electoral Commission isn't just any old reporter or any old journalist, and it's gone beyond that now.
Is that your strategy, Robert, just to stonewall, or the government strategy just to not answer any question and hope it goes away?
Well, firstly, the point that Laura made just then is I'm afraid, absolutely wrong. I mean, I knock on doors constantly in my own constituency and around the country, and what people are talking about is the success of the vaccine rollout in particular. They recognise the government's had an unprecedented challenge and recognise that it has performed exceptionally well in, for example, creating that testing diagnostic network from nowhere and doing 40% of the entire world's genome sequencing, and crucially, the vaccine success that I referred to just a moment ago. And people, as their local elections are getting closer, are also focusing not only on the fact that Conservative government delivers on its priorities, but so do Conservative councils. That is absolutely what people are talking about on the doorstep.
Let's talk about something different, but you are the Transport Minister, one of them. The Sun front page, or perhaps it's not the front page, it might be inside. Oh, it is the front page. Exclusive joy for sun seekers, June holidays. And that is referring to the fact that there could be foreign holidays for British holiday makers post-June, but not perhaps without a COVID passport. Now, Grant Shapps has been talking about this today, the Transport Secretary. Robert said, when will this be introduced?
So we've been very clear about this in the Global Travel Task Force report that was published earlier this month. And we've said that there won't be any international travel before May the 17th. And at the beginning of May, we'll be able to give more detail about which countries will be in which of the lists that we've talked about, the red, amber, green list that we've talked about. It's too early, I'm afraid, to give any more detail on that at the moment. And that's simply because when we make that decision, we need to be close enough to the decision point that the data is accurate.
Right.
With regards to your question around vaccine passports, which are certification, which you were also asking me about, we're also looking to see what part they may be able to play, both bilaterally and through multilateral organisations, things like the World Health Organization and ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Authority, to see what we may be able to do there. We'll be working with, of course, NHSX, the digital arm of the NHS, to ensure that that vaccine rollout that I've referred to a number of times today is something that you can demonstrate when you are able to go abroad. So there will be more details coming in the next couple of weeks. I'm sorry I can't go any further at the moment, but we're looking to see what we can do to make things easier so people can travel, but in a safe way.
And Minister, what would you say to our viewers right now if they've seen some of the newspaper reporting and thought, actually, I am going to go online, I'm going to book my holiday to give me something to look forward to in the summer? Should they do that, or should they wait? And have you booked a holiday in the hope that you might be able to go?
Right, so I think there's a number of points here. This is a key point, I know, for all of your viewers. And I would caution people at the moment just to wait until we are able to give the details of which country falls into which list, because that's going to be absolutely key. If it's a green list where you don't have to quarantine, that's one thing. If you're on an amber list where you do have to quarantine, that may make a difference to you, depending upon what your job is.
All right.
But there's one key point as well, if I may just very quickly make this, because it is important. It's ensuring that you understand what the booking terms of your your holiday, if you book that, are to ensure that you don't lose out if circumstances change.
All right.
Because if there's one thing we've learned about coronavirus, it's unpredictable.
All right, Alex, thank you for sitting there patiently. Are you considering booking a holiday, or do you think it's too early to think about foreign travel?
Well, me and my wife are going to Scotland the beginning of August for a birthday, but everything else is far too premature. As once again, it's chaotic communications. Robert says, for goodness sake, don't do anything yet. We might need to tell his boss this, because clearly his boss or someone in the office has been talking to major national newspapers who've put it on the front page. And, it's this constant chaos of communications, of lurching one way to the other, just indicative of a complete lack of grip of this crisis. I mean, borders in general have been a disaster. The government talk about hotel quarantine. Of the 20,000 people coming to this country each day, about 1% of them are going into that hotel quarantine.
Right.
And yet the Prime Minister said there will be a third wave of COVID.
Sure.
And we're doing nothing to protect ourselves against those new variants.
Alex, do you have a plan? Does Labour have a plan for opening up international travel?
We'd like to focus on the moment, which is keeping people safe and securing our recovery from COVID, which would be an extension of hotel quarantine. That's our plan. At the point where our vaccine rollout is secure, the data is accurate, you could then make a decision to expand and to open up and to use the means that Robert's talked about. But we're way away from that, and that's why this briefing is irresponsible.
All right, Alex Norris and Robert Courts, thank you very much for joining us. Laura, I cut you off before because of Prime Minister's questions about the appointment of a new Standards Commissioner.
Yes, Lord Kuenssberg, who is formerly of Buckingham Palace, a very revered and well-respected public servant, has just been appointed by the Prime Minister to basically be his official sleaze buster. Now, it matters in the context of all of the things that we've been discussing in the last couple of months, but the post has been vacant. Now, our viewers might remember that the Home Secretary was investigated for claims of bullying. The then advisor said that she had broken the rules. Boris Johnson didn't accept it. He quit, and the job has finally been filled after a period of months.
So those shoes have been filled. Thank you
Indeed.
very much to all of my guests. Thanks to you, Laura. That's all we've got time for. I will be back tomorrow at 12:15. Please join me then. Bye-bye.